Grazing conference with Dr. Martin Entz. My name's Johanna Murray. I'm the extension coordinator here at Peace Country Beef and Forage Association. So tonight I'll be emceeing a little bit, and Katie McLaughlin will be down in the chat. So a bit of housekeeping before we get going. All of the recording will be sent out about a week after the live session. The poll that's running now, that'll all be anonymous. I'll go through and make sure that all of everybody's videos are blurred out and all that sort of stuff, so you don't have to be shy about turning on your video when we start chatting at the end of the But until we get to the discussion period, we are going to ask that you keep your microphones muted, and if we notice that there's some feedback happening or any of that sort of stuff, we will go in and mute you. Don't take it personally. We're just trying to make sure that the recording sounds nice at the end of the day. So quick rundown of who PCBFA is before we get going. We are a charitable applied research and extension group based out of Fairview, Alberta. We were founded by producers in 1982, and we serve 10 municipalities in Northern Alberta now. Our mission is to provide practical, reliable information based on local research. So our research is producer-led. We have a board of 10 producer directors. They tell us what they want to know and what's relevant to their operations, and we base our research on that. Our small plot trials are in Fairview, but we also have a number of satellite research sites around the piece, and as well as some on-farm trials where we can test our projects at a bigger scale. We run extension as well. Obviously, we've got a couple of, we've got events and webinars, and we've also got a monthly newsletter for members and a bi-weekly podcast that goes up every other Tuesday, as well as providing production advice and expertise. We've got a lot of, a long history of research up here, and we're happy to provide information on that. If you are interested in any of our research, or you want to keep track of our events or any of that sort of stuff, what we're doing, you can check us out at peacecountrybeef.ca. All of our links to our social media and contact information is all there. So the other thing is, if you think of a question after the session's done, you can give us a shout there, and we'll do our best to get it answered. So tonight we are grateful to have Dr. Martin Entz with us. We're gonna have him present, and then we're gonna have a quick break, and then we'll get into discussion and Q&A. So that's what I've got for my presentation. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martin Entz. He is a professor of cropping systems and natural systems agriculture at the University of Manitoba. Martin's research focuses on ecologically integrated farming systems, and he leads the Glenlea long-term rotation study, which is the longest running organic versus conventional farming systems experiment in Canada, I believe. He's also the founder of the U of M's Natural Systems Agriculture Program, which explores cropping systems based on processes found in nature, specifically the natural grassland ecosystems of Prairie Canada. So with that all out of the way, here's Martin.
Hey, thanks, Joanna. And good evening, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. And I'm sure if you can't, then Joanna will let me know. So welcome all 52 of you. That's amazing on a Friday night. I'm very, very pleased. So greetings from my place here in Manitoba. I'm a little bit familiar with the forage sector in the Peace River region. I've been there. I've done a little bit of work there, and I used to work in Southern Alberta, actually a long, long time ago before I went back to school. And so it's nice to see you and hear you. And I also see by the chat that people are from all over the place, and that's just fantastic. So congratulations to this organization for doing a great job of getting excitement around this topic. And I'm going to get right into the topic here. So I'm sharing my screen, and I'm assuming that you can see.
Looks good.
Johanna? Okay, great, fantastic. So I'm an agronomist, and I got my PhD in actually, water use efficiency of crops at the University of Saskatchewan a long time ago. And I've worked in industry before I went back to school, and I also was a farm manager for a while. So practical agriculture is very near and dear to my heart. I have to be really honest. When I would there's people that really like animals, and there's people that really like agronomy and machines. And I was never the animal person. I came to that later. I came to that when I started thinking about natural systems agriculture. So the title of my talk is Bringing Animals Back to the Land and Doing It Wisely. I think you know something about this. And, remember giving a talk on agroecology at Ryerson University in Toronto. And, I started off by talking about ranching. And I said, this is really something that if you spend some time with people who work with cattle on the landscape, you will learn a lot about natural systems. And, that's something that I think people have really appreciated once they understand that. And I would put myself in that group. So on this slide, I've also got a map here of the prairie provinces, and I know there are people from East Kootenay, and there's people from Quebec, and there's people from United States. But these dots here actually depict field studies, where mostly agriculture and Agri-Food Canada scientists, but also some university scientists and others, looked at the role of forages in cropping systems. And when I started at the University of Manitoba and I was hired to do sort of cropping systems with an emphasis on forages, I immediately, tried to find out, where's their information. And I got information from two sources. One is a lot of these long-term studies, and secondly, from farmers. So anyways, that's a little bit of my introduction. When we think about natural systems agriculture, we think about grazing. We think about growing plants and the interaction between animals and plants. And if we, run a list of benefits of that integration, they're pretty profound, actually. There's two little stories that I want to tell in this connection. The first one is the serious one, that Anne Clark, who was at the University of Guelph, she was very outspoken. And she said, when we had livestock and crops integrated, we had a system that functioned. And we created from that functional system two dysfunctional systems, one intensive confined livestock and one monoculture cropping. And that, she's not wrong. And the students that I teach, many of them say, I'm just into crop production. I'm not really interested in livestock. And I say, oh, what do you grow? Oh, we grow, canola, wheat, soybeans, maybe some oats or barley. And I said, well, I hate to tell you, but you're neck deep in animal agriculture, because that's where your canola meal goes. That's where your soybeans go. That's where your barley goes. And that's where a part of your wheat goes. And so, we are integrated, but we can do it better. So the second story is the funny one. And this is, I forget, he was from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. And he's, tongue in cheek at a talk said, the Iowa State University, they've got brilliant scientists. They discovered that plants like to stay put and animals can move around. And so, that was, where that's going, right? So animals can be on the landscape. And when we look at animals, there are many to choose from. I know, beef cattle are very popular, but, there are a whole host of other animals which can interact with pastures, with grasslands, pigs, sheep. We don't want to talk about goats, but they can do it too. So, okay, so, you know, when I look at the literature, I look at, you know, where innovation is in sustainable agriculture, you know, we make up lists of things. And so crop rotation is definitely on the list. It's really important. Tillage management, cover crops, organic production, agroforestry, so maybe some, you know, water management, but livestock integration is always on the list. It's on anybody who's thinking about this. It's always on the list. And so it's important. It's recognized pretty well around the world. And it's actually appreciated, especially in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where the livestock are part of the, you know, bank account for the farmers. And yeah. Now, I want to roll through a little bit of history. I think this is useful because if we're farming here in Canada or in other parts of North America, we're heavily influenced by agriculture in Northern Europe because that's where a lot of our thinking came from. And so let's quickly review what happened. So in 1500 and early 1600, people in the most advanced agricultural countries in Europe, and probably the one in 1500 was the Netherlands. So if you have a Dutch heritage, give yourself a pat on the back. If there's two Dutch people there, give each other 20 bucks. Okay, you earned it. You had the leading agricultural system back then. Then people shifted to the 3-crop rotation. That actually took over 100 years. And that rotation wasn't just fallow crop, it was fallow and then wheat or barley or oats, depending on where you were, and then maybe beans or some kind of a legume. And that was a big transition because people had to, you know, the land tenure changed. And then in the early 1800s, the 4-year crop rotation got going. And this was actually the first time that animals were part of the cropping system. I mean, animals had always been part of agriculture. They were on the common lands grazing, but now they're integrated. And so there's much written about the Norfolk 4-course crop rotation, and it started in southern England. And so it had clover or a legume grazed, something like wheat, then something like turnips or mangels, a little bit of manure going on there, and then another cereal could be oats or barley if you're in northern part of the British Isles, or it could be wheat if you're in the south. So the significance of this is that the animals were integrated, and that allowed that nutrient, the manure from the animal, to enrich the soil. And this actually caused a population explosion in Northern Europe because there was more food, it was more productive. And then about, 70 years, 80 years later, we see a lot of evidence in the history books about the 7-year crop rotation. And this was the 4-year crop rotation, but with a few more interesting twists. And so this is in my first language, which is German, but very quickly, again, you've got the clover and the sheep. Johanna, can you see my cursor, and am I making sense?
Yes, we can see your cursor.
All right, beautiful. And then we've got wheat, and then we've got, again, sort of turnips or fodder beets or mangels or whatever with some manure, then oats. And then we go to a pulse crop like pea, maybe potatoes here. And then it could be winter rapeseed, actually, wheat and that type of thing. This rotation also involved some sugar beets, and they would be substituted in here if you had a sugar extraction factory near your farm. This, I'm just going to say, this is probably one of the best crop rotations that, we could even aspire to here in Canada. So what happened in Europe, of course, then we had cheap nitrogen fertilizer came along with the Haber-Bosch process, which started in about 1908. The Germans figured out how to take the ammonia, the nitrogen out of the atmosphere to put it into ammonia. And at that point, these crop rotations kind of unraveled. Fertilizer was available. And so now, if you go to the area of Northern Europe, you'll see winter wheat and winter canola. maybe a little bit of barley, a little bit of faba beans, the odd bit of sunflower or corn, but it's basically monoculture. I'm very interested, as you can tell, in this 7-year crop rotation. This is my father on the top right here in 1937, bringing in a load of rapeseed or canola. And on their farm, they had 7 fields for the 7-year crop rotation. And this is my grandfather. So, you know, that was really quite good. And I'm quoting Wes Jackson here, who says perhaps there was a time when we were wiser than we are today. And I think this story is fairly compelling, right? This 7-year crop rotation, certainly the organic farmers that I work with, if they're not thinking along these lines, you know, it's going to be hard to be successful. So that's a bit of the history lesson. And it really shaped where we came from. So when, you know, our history from Northern Europe to North America, you know, brought along those ideas of rotation, animal integration. And certainly if we look here in the University of Illinois, 1876 is when they started this experiment. It's the oldest experimental field in the United States, established, 1876. And they were, you know, this was the time when the Europeans had the 7-year crop rotation. And so what we're showing here in the graph is, and we're getting to forages, is the soil organic carbon. And you double this for the organic matter roughly. And so from 1904 up to here, 1988, you can see what happened. The study started 40 years before this, and the organic matter would have all been the same, we would have assumed. But even after 40 years, you can see the rotation that has alfalfa sequences in it. It's maintaining a much higher organic matter. The rotation that has corn, soybeans, and in it has slightly higher carbon. The continuous corn has the lowest carbon. So what's the moral of this story, of these really interesting experiments that are still going on? It's that crop rotation with perennial forages really matters in terms of, you know, keeping soils healthy. Keeping carbon is the food source for the soil organisms. So that was quite interesting. And I'm going to skip the next slide, which actually shows that the maintenance of, well, I'll quickly go to it here. The maintenance of soil carbon was also happening in the subsoil, not just the topsoil. And so if you're growing forages, you're also interested in what's happening in the subsoil, because you're influencing that much more than in a canola wheat rotation. And so here between 1913 and 1923, you can see in the continuous corn, there was still a reduction over that 10-year period in subsoil carbon. So there was so much that we learned from these long-term studies. And so when, you know, most of us entered agriculture, this knowledge was already there, and we're continually relearning it. And that's okay. You know, we're learning it and adapting it to modern times. Now, just staying with history for a little bit longer, I wanted to talk a little bit about manure, because who doesn't want to talk about manure right after dinner? Yeah, exactly. You get me. Okay, so there is this long-term study just north of London, England, at Rothamsted. Some of you may have heard of this, some of you may have been there. And this was actually a research station started by somebody who was starting to sell fertilizer. And they weren't selling Haber-Bosch fertilizer back here because it wasn't developed until right about here. They were actually selling like Chilean nitrate and guano from bat caves and stuff like that. And also selling phosphorus. So they started this research station at Rothamsted, and it's still going today. And there's a whole bunch of different experiments there, some just on forages, some on wheat. This is the long-term winter wheat study. It's called broad bulk. And so here are the grain yields. and 33 tons per acre is about 45 bushels per acre, something like that. So these new grain yields here, they're up above 160 bushels per acre. So what did they learn? Well, they learned that, continuous wheat in the blue line here with no fertilizer, nothing, it bumps along at about, 18 bushels, 20 bushels per acre. Same thing with the long-term plots at Lethbridge. That's about how much they produce every year with nothing added, unless of course there's no rain. And then we've got these rotations here that have different treatments, that have some farmyard manure or that have fertilizer. And you can see the yields have gone up because they've started liming, then they started using herbicides in the late 1950s, semi-dwarf cultivars, fungicides, and now they're up to these very high yields. And let's take a look at what they're doing up here. So these two sort of winning yields, grain yields, are the function of a treatment where they just get fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium only, and that's over here. Okay, they're getting about 250 pounds of nitrogen, actual nitrogen per acre per year. That's what you need with yields like that. And then this green one here, it's NPK plus manure, and they're adding half as much nitrogen, and they're adding farmyard manure in here. Okay, I haven't told you anything you don't already know. You know all this. This is how it works. But what they also measured here is the soil, again, going back to the soil carbon, the soil health. And the line up here, this orange one, which has really high yields that only gets fertilizer, its soil carbon levels are actually flat. They don't do anything. And and here, where you add half as much nitrogen fertilizer and you add manure, you can see you've got much higher levels of soil carbon. In fact, it's well over twice as much soil carbon. This is interesting because we actually sometimes wonder, we put manure on land, and especially if it's stock manure with straw in it, nothing really happens. Sometimes nothing happens for a long time. But over time, it does matter. And this is pretty good evidence of that. Okay, the final European long-term study I wanted to share with you is from Germany, and it's from the former East Germany and now part of Germany, and the farm where my dad grew up is just up here, by the way. And what they did here is looked at the top 30 centimeters of soil, so about the top foot. And these red things are not the soil, they're the macropores. What they used is they actually x-rayed these soils from different crop rotations. So what we're looking at between the top and the bottom of the soil is parts of the soil that are actually have macropores, and pores in soils are really good. It aerates them, it helps them function well. And you can see where at the bottom here we have zero manure, but we're adding fertilizer, zero manure with no fertilizer. So you can see adding fertilizer over 100 years, this study started in 1902, it does make a difference to the soil structure, to the soil structure and the life of the soil, because some of these channels would be made by earthworms or ants or something, or just better root systems. And you can already see what happens as, let's say we go over here where we're not adding any fertilizer, as we go from zero manure to 20 tons per hectare every 2 years or 30 tons per hectare every 3 years, you can see the amount of macropores go up. And the micropores. So you can see the benefit that manure has. And when it's done in combination with fertilizer, we get even more activity in soils. But the message I really wanted to, back to forages and grazing, the manure that cycles from the animals back to the land is very important. You know that, but it's really fun to look at some of this evidence. Now, Johanna mentioned just the Glenlea study, which started in 1992. So it's finished 30 years now. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it other than to say that, we're making some of these measurements at Glenlea as well. And one of the slides that I just wanted to share with you is from our organic rotation. And this rotation is a 4-year rotation, 2 years of alfalfa cut for hay, and then wheat, and then flax, and then back to alfalfa. And what we noticed, one of the important lessons coming out of this study is that in the organic system, the alfalfa grew gangbusters for the first 15 years. We grew great crops. We had great organic wheat crops after. And then what happened is the alfalfa just did poorer and poorer and poorer every year. And what was happening is we were exporting a lot of nutrients, especially phosphorus with the alfalfa hay. But because we weren't putting manure back, the system was becoming manure and nutrient depleted. And so in 2007, we split the plots, and you can see, yeah, we split the plots right there. This whole plot here is alfalfa, the alfalfa phase. And the front half receives a little bit of composted beef cattle manure once every 4 years. And the back half does nothing. We planted the back half, but there's so little nutrients, it doesn't grow very well. So again, I think an important lesson for the role of nutrient cycling from animals integrated with crops. People sometimes, look at grazing and go shake their heads and say, that's really not really great for the land. It's better just to, cut your forage and leave your animals off the fields. There's less compaction and then go back and spread the manure. And sometimes, in some cases that can be useful if the soil is high clay content and it's really wet. You don't want to have the animals compacting the soil. But what we know from ecology and agricultural studies is that grazing is actually really good for plants and it's really good for the soil. And this is, there's a lot of evidence for this. There's evidence even from Southern Alberta at the 1-4 Ranch and at Staveley, the Ag Canada sites down there. And this work comes from Alan Franz-Lubers, who actually spent some time in the Peace River region as a postdoc working with Charlie Arshad back a long time ago. Alan Franz-Lubers is now a USDA scientist in Georgia. He does a lot of work on soil health in grazing systems. And I remember when he presented this data, I couldn't believe it. This is the first time I had seen anything like this. And he showed that what they did is they grew 5-year Bermuda grass cover crop after corn, for example. And they tracked the carbon in the soil. And they did it very well. They're good soil scientists. And they found out that where the Bermuda grass was left ungrazed for 5 years, this is how much carbon it sequestered. That's tons. So, 0.65 tons per hectare per year. That's not bad. And of course, where they hayed it every year, they're less. So if you just look at those two numbers, makes perfect sense. And then you look at this number, and what they found is when the forages were grazed, they actually sequestered more carbon. So that's really interesting. I think I've said that. So here's something from the paper. Soil organic carbon sequestration during the first 5 years of management was similar between cattle grazing pressures. Okay, they had high stock density and low stock density, but was much reduced in unharvested and hayed management. And this is a peer-reviewed study, and there's been, like I say, other studies. What's going on? Why is this happening? Well, maybe you have some of your own ideas, which you could talk about later. What the plant physiologists tell us is that when the animal tugs on that plant, it's pulling it, and a lot of those root hairs are torn off. And a lot of that soluble carbon that's at the interface between the plant and the soil is kind of removed from the plant. Well, that is food, that's fodder for the soil microorganisms, which take that, which are much better able to consume that than the plant can. And they take that sugar and they turn it into soil carbon in different processes. Okay, so what I've done so far, how are we doing for time here? I've talked about some history. I've talked about, some of the physiological processes. I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize when we talk about land management is in its natural state, the prairie grassland had very deep-rooted plants. And, when we remove those deep-rooted plants, we have problems, right? And so having these perennials in the system is really important. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. I had a grad student who was really interested in this subject, and she was actually a civil engineer from Ottawa, and she decided to study grass systems. And she did a bunch of case studies of grass-finished farms, dairy farms in Ontario and beef farms in the prairies. And I'm just going to really quickly run through one farm. And this is not telling you anything you don't know, but I think it really illustrates how agriculture can be done well with integrated animals. So this happens to be an organic grass-finished farm. And the rotation is, it's an 8-year rotation, similar to the European, 3 years of alfalfa in blue. So all these blue spots on the farm are alfalfa, flax, oat, green manure, which is purple. Where's purple? There's purple. Green manure. And I like this, clearly that field is following that water course. That's very, very good management. You know about that. And then wheat and then rye. And very good rotation because it's an organic farm. Without that good rotation, it's not going to be profitable. And a lot of perennials. All the green area here is in perennials, and then the green manure is in purple. Let's add that in. So a high proportion of that farm is in perennials. And we know perennials are good. So if we look at Western Canada and we look at some surveys, integrated crop livestock farms tend to have about 30% of their land in perennials. This particular grass finished beef farm has 61% of the farm in perennials. That's really terrific. And then I can't, but I'm interested in how farmers are selecting their herds for grass finishing better and that type of thing. So here we have Howell Park Farms. It's about 2,000 acres. And then we have what I call the business as usual farms over here. The ecological value of this integrated crop livestock farm is huge. Look at, you think, my brain sort of goes, oh, that's messy and this is nice and organized, but ecologically, this is much better. The water courses and ravines have been left. The wetlands and potholes have not been drained. Perennials to build and protect soil, retain runoff, and improve the soil and ecosystem health. And, we're trying to have these best management practices in this business as usual, but, it kind of reminds me of the story that my friend Rennie Van Acker told me when this person came to a farmyard and said, how do I get to, I want to use one of your time, how do I get to Crooked Creek? I like that name. And the person said, well, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And that's kind of where the business as usual is at. It's kind of, it's very difficult to build a sustainable system on something like this. We have to try, but this really is got a lot more to offer. And this farmer also, knows the necessity of legumes in that organic system to feed nitrogen into those organic wheat and flax crops. The problem is taking that whole year out of production is very expensive, and land is not getting cheaper, and it's tough. So a lot of our research has been on grazing these green manures to try to improve the profitability of them. And we're seeing more of that because, of course, most of the nutrients that the animals take into their bodies goes right back out the other end. And And then if you have good grazing management where you don't have the nutrients all ending up around the water hole, it can be quite useful. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about grazing these green manures in organic systems. And this is just our bragging rights here. This is really showing the different graduate students who worked on these systems over the years. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeding some grain to your livestock, okay? I'm not, but Myra Van D, my grad student, was very interested in the grass finishing because of how it can potentially affect the, the healthfulness of the animal products, whether it's milk or whether it's meat. So, and that's what was happening on Howe Park Farms, this real interest in a grass finished regime. But let me talk about grazing manure. So here we have a typical green manure crop on an organic farm. Leafed peas, probably 40-10 forage peas with some oats in the background, maybe even some faba beans thrown in something. So if you grow this green manure, this data is about 6 years old. You lose about $166 per acre. It's probably over $200 now. So we did a lot of experiments on if we grazed it, what would it do to the nitrogen? What utilization is there? And because we're, poor university researchers, all we could afford was a herd of sheep. And so we actually had them for about 12 years. And so we did a lot of work growing the green manure and then growing an organic wheat crop the next year and an organic rye crop the year after. And so the standard practice was to grow this nice pea green manure and then disc it, or maybe use a blade roller, eventually disc it or put it in the soil, and then compare that to grazing. And so this is how much nitrogen was available to that wheat crop in year 1, and this is rye in year 2. So kilograms per hectare, close to pounds per acre. And this is how much nitrogen was taken up after we grazed. And this is something that we would measure over and over again. Even when we grazed just rye stubble, the following year, we got a bump in the available nitrogen to the crop. And you probably understand the whole process. The rumen digests that food, makes those nutrients available, sometimes too available, so we have to be careful of that. It's an awesome system. So what we doing some very simple green manure math, you could easily grow 5,000 pounds per acre of green manure biomass in the Peace River region or in other parts of northern Alberta or in Quebec or in people from Ohio, they can grow twice that. So at a 50% utilization rate of grazing, you got 250 pounds per acre. So our calculations were you can get about 175 live weight gain on that. And that would give us an income above the cutoff line. We were actually making a bit of profit here, about $30 an acre. And that includes all the fencing and those types of things. So grazing the green manures, when I started seeing farmers do it more, organic farmers doing, I got really excited because we spent so much time studying it and trying to understand how it works and growing different mixtures and that type of thing. And we even tried hairy vetch, which is one of the most impressive nitrogen fixing plants that I've worked with in organic as an annual green manure in organic systems. And well, when you look at the nitrogen uptake of wheat the year after, it doesn't maybe look that impressive. But so here is where we tilled it. Here's where we hayed it. And then, we tried a few different grazing systems and, rotational grazing, basically going over the hairy vetch 2 or 3 times over the season made a lot more nitrogen available. Was that because the hairy vetch grew better? Partly, and it was also partly because grazing can stimulate growth. So this has gotten so much interest by organic farmers is the some of the, like, I know that the Manitoba Organic Alliance, the producer organization, they're trying to marry up farmers who have cattle who need summer grazing and organic farmers who have forage or have annual green manures to fuel their soil with nitrogen, but they want to make some money off that. So you can see the possible connection. Now, when we talk about soil organic matter, the point of this slide is that we talk a lot about building up soil organic matter in soils, and that's great, and we have to do that. But we also, you know, we're part of an economic enterprise, and we want to stimulate that organic matter to give up some of that nitrogen to grow our crops, or to give up some of that phosphorus. And so cattle grazing, or grazing with animals, is an excellent way to do that. It's an excellent way to stimulate, bring that organic matter into the nutrient cycle of the crop. And sometimes so is tillage. We've often get caught up, well, we got a carbon sequester, we're so bad, we got to do that and save the planet. And yes, we have to save the planet, but we also have to think smart about how we cycle our nutrients and the resources in our soils. Livestock grazing is a big part of that. It's mostly in the rumen, but it's also the hoof action and the, you know, the movement of the surface soil and other things. So, okay, let's get back to manure, because, right, yeah, everybody loves that. So I have this lecture in my class called Cow Biology. I teach organic agriculture to the diploma, the degree, and the graduate level. And cow biology is a really fun lecture. You know, we try to get a hold of a bunch of manure samples, we get them analyzed, and then we try to guess, what did those animals eat? And, you know, this is really important for organic farming, because sometimes, you know, students who, you know, imagine they're putting together their organic model farm, and they say, well, I'm going to have livestock and I'm going to have crops, and so the crops will get nutrients from the livestock, so I'll be golden. But I remind them, I say, well, you know, if your soil is deficient in phosphorus and you're feeding the animals phosphorus deficient forage, they're going to produce phosphorus deficient manure. And so that cycle, that system is going to grind down to a halt. And you need to measure the nutrients in your manure. You need to measure the nutrients in your crops and find out where you're at, and in your soil, and find out where you're at. And then you may need to supplement that farm with nutrients. And how do you do that? Maybe buy some bales and bring in bales and bale graze and enrich your soil. I'm sure many of you do that. Or you could buy in some kind of protein that's high in phosphorus to supplement your animals. So that's the first thing that we have to remember, is that if we're feeding nutrient deficient feeds, you know, we're going to have nutrient deficient manure. But the other, I think, thing that you see, and you probably also know, is how quickly do your dung pats, like what happens to your dung pats on the pasture or on the land? You know, maybe you have some thoughts you want to share later about this. You know, the dung pats, if they degrade quickly, you know, that shows a really healthy ecosystem. I don't want to go too long here, because I want to leave some time for, maybe we'll just, I've got a couple of more themes and a story from New Mexico that I want to share. Livestock, you know, we know they allow integrated agriculture to function. So this is a farm in Costa Rica. It's about 3 acres. And this farm had 12 animals. All the manure went into this, essentially a silage bag. And then the methane went up the tube here, and there was a house on the road, and they used the methane to burn a little Bunsen burner to boil their milk to make cheese. That was pretty elegant. So I had the opportunity to work down here for a while, and you know, the stuff I saw there, I went, we should start doing this. And now we are. And so I want to give this example, which I don't just use when I speak in Alberta, but the idea of taking dairy manure at Lethbridge Biogas and you know, doing exactly the same thing that they did with that silage bag, drawing off the methane, generating electricity from it, and then so making electricity from poop, And then the leftovers is digestate. And this is actually an organic pig farm just north of Waterloo, Ontario, that we work with. And they use this digestate as a supplemental fertilizer in their 1,000-acre organic farm. And then we can also bring in insects now to process some of this food waste and manure and produce high protein grubs, but produces a fertilizer that can be used organically. So the thing about an integrated farm is when you're integrated, you don't see waste as waste. You just see it as another resource. And this silage bag is just awesome because if you put all the manure in there, you make it airtight, what comes out of there is carbon and hydrogen. That's methane, carbon and hydrogen. And that'll burn and that'll boil your milk. You can make cheese. I didn't know you had to boil milk to make cheese, but maybe you don't. I don't know. That's what they do. But what's left over in the silage bag is all your phosphorus, all your nitrogen, all your potassium, your micronutrients. So that waste then becomes a resource. Same thing over here in a modern, sophisticated system. Where am I here? Yeah, I got time. The second story is, this is actually a study done in white oaks pasture in the southeast part of the United States. And they compared like a corn soybean system to feed livestock compared to what we'd call an advanced regenerative system that produced livestock on the landscape. And then they asked themselves the question, how much land do we need to just produce enough food? This is recorded, so you can take a look at this. But which one is the hectares of land needed for feed for these for the livestock? And the multi-species, regenerative agriculture required way more land. And so we hear that a lot, right? The corn soybean system is just so productive and the canola meal system is just so productive. But I think there's a few things missing here. First of all, this is what the soybeans looked like just down the road this summer. We had a very bad drought. And, we had section after section after section looking like this. So you can already tell what's going on here. We got drought, so the soybeans look awful. And then you've got roadside salinity, and there's your kochia. And that needs to be factored into this. That we have to remember that this landscape was a grassland before we plowed it up and started growing soybeans on it, or wheat, or whatever else we're growing. So, and the other thing that we need to be aware of. We can't be cavalier with this, but I am so tired of hearing people say, we need all this technology because we got to feed the world. And yes, the world has to be fed. Because people say, well, the population of the world is going up. Well, there is people doing research on what is the population of the planet going to be in the future. And so right now, we're about here. And the projections are all over the map, but most projections are that the population is going to max out at about 2064, maybe close to 9.5 billion, and we already have enough food to feed 9.5 billion, and then the population is going to go down. And the more young women are educated around the world, the faster that rate of increase drops. We're still going to have lots of people on the planet, so it's okay to educate girls. It's, in fact, really, it's the right thing to do. And so, a lot of agribusiness is going, I was counting on overpopulation and the fear mongering that goes along with that. And then, you have smart food cities, you have food. So my point is that we can take a breath. And we can design an agriculture system that serves everybody, the landscape, including feeding us. And animals are part of that. And this is my final story, and then I'm done. And this comes from New Mexico. So this is thanks to Dr. Sangu Angadi, who was a PhD student of mine, and he is now a professor in New Mexico State University at Clovis. And he does his work right on the edge of the Ogallala Aquifer. This is the largest underground lake in the world, apparently. There's other big ones. There's one in below Beijing in China, which is being drained very quickly. There's other big ones, but this is a big one. And it has been amazing for people to, pump irrigation water out of here and have a super productive agriculture. But the problem is the Ogallala Aquifer is in places, it's drying up. And that's what's happening here in eastern New Mexico. And so what Sangu's job has been is to figure out how farmers can still make a living in a place like this, where they've built up the infrastructure to have water all the time, when now there is not enough water to irrigate your whole pivot. And you can look at satellite maps over the edges of the Ogallala Aquifer, and you'll see all kinds of half pivots, brown pivots, and it's a very serious issue. And so what Sangu has worked on, and he actually he's a very humble guy, comes from South India, very humble guy, and he talked about putting these perennial buffer strips in here, and that's used for grazing or for forage production. And there's lots of cattle in this area. And then they can still use parts of the pivot. So this is a research pivot, but in a commercial farm, you'd have the whole pivot with these perennial strips. And these perennial buffers, they serve a whole bunch of other purposes. They reduce the wind speed over the area in the off season, so the evaporation is less. It's just a win-win-win situation. They help with biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water holding capacity. And so now what they're doing is irrigating only 2/3 of the pivot, and then 1/3 of it is these buffer strips, and they do not get water. The pivot will not deliver water to them. So that's a very novel use of crop livestock integration to deal with a resource constraint. And this resource constraint is real, it's not going away. And it's also happening in other parts of the world. And I mentioned Beijing, and I've had the opportunity to work in Northwest China, and they're doing exactly the same type of things. And the way that agriculture can be sustainable is a really intelligent integration of all the parts of it, including livestock. So that is the end of my talk, Joanna. I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you again. Thank you very much for your attention.
All righty. Thank you very much, Martin. That was an interesting presentation. I know I learned some things. So if anybody has questions, please drop them in the chat. Katie, do we have some questions to start off with?
We do. So first off, Shorty wanted to know, on the very first slide, you had a map of the Western provinces with long-term forage research. He was wondering what that dot was near Edmonton. Was that Lacombe?
Sorry, that dot near Edmonton is Breton.
Breton, okay. Thank you.
Lacombe didn't have any long-term forage-based crop rotations that I know of, at least not in the literature. That's University of Alberta, Breton. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. We had another question wondering about the European 7-year rotation. Could you just take us through that one more time, Martin?
Sure. So it starts with green feed, Grünfutter, usually clover in Northern Europe. We would probably lean a bit more towards alfalfa, but maybe clover a bit in the Peace River with some grasses. then a cereal, and that could be winter wheat, or it could be spring wheat, probably winter wheat in that area. Then we're looking again at livestock feed, or if you're close to a sugar beet factory, people would grow sugar beets. It was more profitable. But these are turnips or fodder beets or mangels, and they were grown in Northern Europe for a lot. You can feed more pigs per acre with these things than you can with barley or wheat. And then this was a summer grain, and it was sometimes, this is an intercrop actually. So it's 70, it's something like oats and peas. So that's an intercrop. So it's a summer grain, and a Hülsenfrucht means a pulse crop. And then we go back to winter wheat, and then something like potato. It could also be sugar beet there, and then to another grain. And that could be either a summer grain, which would be oats, or a winter wheat. So I hope that helps.
Wonderful. And I just received a follow-up question to that, is how were livestock used and integrated in the 7-year crop rotation?
Well, like they were integrated in perhaps not the best, well, they were on summer pasture, and most of the 7-year crop rotation was about winter feed. Yeah. So how much grazing of stubble and that type of thing, the historical accounts have most of the livestock on permanent pasture on those common lands or our community pastures in the summer. And so the animals were used as consumers of some of that feed, although here you have the animal shown on the clover, so there's probably some grazing, and then the animals would provide the manure. And there's an old German saying that if you want to know how good a farmer is, this is from that era, you have to go look at their manure pile. And the management of their manure will tell you how good a farmer they are. So, yeah.
Awesome.
So so this type of rotation, like on Howe Park Farm, having these clovers and just growing them for the nutrients, it's much more economical to graze them. And so, and they do have an animal here, so maybe that's what they did too. Yeah.
Awesome. So I've been receiving a few questions on grazing versus working down green manure. So first off, you said that with grazing a green manure, that N can nitrogen could potentially be too available. Could you elaborate on that?
What we know is that when the rumen, whether it's a beef cow or a sheep, eats fairly nitrogen-rich food like this, the concentration of ammonia in the urine is going to be very high. There's lots of nitrogen there, and so you get these hot spots in the field, and that's nitrate that can leach, and so is that a problem in the prairies? Usually not, because their season is so short. There are some listeners from Ohio, I think I saw, they would go, hey, wait a minute, in our context, we can lose that nitrogen. So I like the term catch and release crop. So what we also did research on is grazing a nitrogen-rich green manure like this, and then, when the sheep are done, just run over there with a disc and then go in and seed a mixture of maybe, tillage radish or some kind of brassica, because they're very good at grabbing that nitrogen and then next spring releasing it very quickly, so the crop can use it. So the rumen really supercharges the availability of the nitrogen. Now that I think we can also use to our advantage if we are looking at trying to make, like I told you, that example of where we were grazing, not in this slide here, but where we were grazing even fall rise stubble. The following year, we grew wheat, and where we had grazed it, the wheat yields were higher and the protein was higher. The rumen can stimulate nitrogen mineralization out of the soil, and it can transform some of that high carbon to nitrogen ratio straw into more bioavailable nitrogen. And so the animal can be used to speed up the nitrogen supply and the catch crop, or maybe throwing more grass in this mixture will slow down the release of that. So I think it's really interesting right now with nitrogen. You know, we're very interested in all these coatings and things to slow down the availability of that nitrogen, to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions. We can do that through integrated farm management with livestock, with tillage, with species selection, that type of thing.
I love that we can be doing this with animals. I love it. So we had a question about the setup of this experiment, Martin. Just how long were your sheep grazing, and what did you do with what the sheep left behind? Like, how much trash did you leave, and how did you deal with that?
What we did with this is the sheep would pre-graze. We would have plots of whatever green manure they were grazing. They would be on that for a week before they ever went into the plots, you know, to condition them. And that's not long enough, but you know, we're just dumb agronomists, and the resources are always limited. And then the sheep would probably get through the plots, and they would get through it in 2 days. And then after that, we either no-tilled or we tilled it. We did a whole combination of things. We did another, I'm actually going to, we also, because we know if we got a field of green manure, you know, you got this, okay, you got that field there. And, you know, the big problem, if that field is 80 acres, the problem is, and you've only got 50 cows, and your green manure is ready to graze, you know, during a 12-day period, well, you're not going to get through that whatever land with the 50 cows. And so what we looked at is growing strips of different types of green manures across a field that might have had, let's say, organic flax in it the previous year. You seed these strips, and you'd put in something like maybe fall rye in part of it, so the animals can get on that earlier, or winter triticale can graze that. And then the next one would be something like pea oats, and then the next strip would be hairy vetch, and then the next one might be a place where you grow fall rye. We did this, harvested for grain, and then in the spring put red clover in there and have them graze the red clover. And you know where I'm going with this, so that you can actually leave those 50 animals on that 80-acre piece and get value out of that. They can actually be on there for the whole, you know, for 2 months or 6 weeks or whatever. And so putting this into practice is tricky. Usually farmers don't have enough animals to process all their crop. And that's, yeah, that makes sense.
You betcha.
Yeah. And so, you know, you could do custom grazing, you could bring in stalkers, you know, do all that stuff that you animal people understand. And that's tricky too, right? Because animals, they might be skittish, they don't always like to be moved around. And so so we figured if we could take like a 100-acre field and put strips of different things, and you could leave those 50 or 80 animals, or maybe 150 animals in there for a longer period of time, you know, fence them and have them work through the different species as those species become useful to the animals and to the soil. That worked. And that work was done by Joanne Thiessen-Martens, who worked in my lab for many years. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
One last thing there, and then you could also supplement that with a bit of bale grazing. If you had some grass heavy portion of the field where you know you're not adding a lot of nitrogen, you know, you could actually spread some bales in there at strategic times and have the animals come back and move that higher legume feed around, process it, ingest it, and, you know, move the manure around. so that hopefully by the end of the time, you'd have 100 acres with reasonable uniformly spread nitrogen across the whole field.
All right. So we've been talking a lot about growing your own nitrogen. What's the best way to add organic phosphorus? Is there a way to do that, Martin?
Yeah, organic phosphorus is, we actually developed a price list for how much are you paying for your organic phosphorus. And first of all, rock phosphorus doesn't work on alkalis, on neutral pH soils on the prairies. People have looked at that over and over again. Please, if you're on a real acid soil, maybe. Even what they call the soft rock phosphate. And that's, maybe a bit insulting to Alberta, because I know there's a lot of rock phosphate enthusiasm in parts of Alberta, and that's usually not available. Animal manure is the cheapest source, and Joanne actually went to farmers and said, okay, you bought 2 semi-loads of manure from there. We tested the manure, and we actually calculated a price per pound of phosphorus. And so we knew at that time ammonium phosphate was like 60 cents a pound. Now it's probably $1. And our manure phosphorus always came in somewhere between $1 and $2 a pound. And these are farmer examples of where they've gathered manure from their neighbors or from even 90 kilometers away. So that's probably the best source of phosphorus. In organic agriculture. It means that you're going to have to pay some money for it, and you're going to have to haul some nutrients. And you can buy poultry manure for organic production, and it's expensive, but it's important to your system. There's 2 other things very quickly. One is you can buy like bone meal, Tech-Mac from Ontario, very good phosphorus. It's at about $4 a pound, so it's more expensive. Obviously, 4 is bigger than 2. Very good, Martin. And then there's this new source of phosphorus, which is not yet registered for organic. It's basically struvite. It's comes out of wastewater plants. It comes out of sewage treatment plants, actually, and it's precipitated out of the sewage, and it's just white little prills, and it's an amazing phosphorus source. We've done quite a bit of research on it, but it's now registered for organic in Europe, and I'm sure it will be in Canada in 2025. But I don't know what the cost is. It could be more than some local manure. So, and then you've got digestate from the anaerobic digesters, but that's a relatively small amount. We've done the math on the struvite. If we take all the sewage treatment plants in Canada and we extract the struvite from them, we have more than enough phosphorus to fertilize every organic acre in Canada. So.
Okay. Okay, so another question is, when you graze a diverse cover crop, are you able to add different nutrients simply by growing new plants to your ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that, that is shown to be true, that each plant has a different nutrient profile. And I had the real pleasure of working with Fred Provenza. Some of you might know him. He used to be at Utah State, and we worked together in China. And we had lots of time to talk, and I learned so much from Fred because he studied the way animals graze to satisfy their needs nutritionally, and I think you can look up Fred Provenza if you don't already know him. Maybe you've had him as a speaker. And you can get YouTube videos, and this is really his wheelhouse. But we know that plants will harvest different nutrients out of the soil system, and so that's established. The question then becomes, and this is where Fred Provenza comes in, how do the animals interact with that? And that's what, maybe I could have a story or two from your community there. How do animals graze differently in those mixtures versus, one species to satisfy their own needs? Are there things that farmers, ranchers have seen because that's the other part of that equation.
Okay.
Does that
Here's a
make
bit.
sense? It makes sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I actually read Fred Provenza's book. Highly recommend. It's really good. So here's a bit more of an agronomist question for you, Martin. I'm farming dairy goats on 10.5 acres. I've put in a cover crop that includes lots of perennials, legumes, root vegetables, sunflowers, and I'm actively adding carbon in 3 different ways, including terra preta, Hugenkultur. I don't know if I said that right. I don't think I did. And composted manure. I farm carbon as much as I'm farming dairy goats. Do you have any suggestions for further improvement for carbon?
Well, make sure that you have enough nitrogen there, because to fix carbon in soil, it requires nitrogen. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of soil is about 10:1. And if you put a lot of carbon in, I mean, I think one of them is probably biochar. I mean, you're putting biochar in, that's stable carbon, that's not going to go anywhere. But if you put, like the example that we use with the students is like, if you have a bunch of wheat straw coming out of the back of a combine, and how much of that carbon is actually going to go into the soil and stay there? Well, it's like 1%, 2%, it's very, very low, or 0, because there's not enough nitrogen to keep it there. The microbes eat it. They quickly run out of nitrogen and then they stop. So they die, and then the stuff gets respired out. It's like feeding an animal. If you take those cows in the picture and feed them very low quality, very low protein wheat straw, what happens? They slow down, their dung pats are pyramids, and they belch all that carbon back out. If you supplement that animal with nitrogen, with protein, the rate of passage is faster, the dung pats look flatter, they're nice and squishy, and the animal's got, its rate of gain is much higher, or its milk production is much higher. The soil is the same thing. If you add a lot of carbon to it, and you want that carbon to stick in the soil, you need to have nitrogen. And that's why, so that's the principle. And that's why things like adding, like when you grow, an alfalfa grass mixture or a clover grass mixture, it just stimulates that soil over 5 years a lot more than just growing the grass. It's not the fact that you're only growing the grass, it's the fact that your carbon from that grass is not getting fixed as efficiently because it's out of nitrogen.
Okay. Is a long-term permanent grazing system, no other inputs other than animals, sustainable?
Sure. As long as the starting point is okay. Like if you're starting with a deficiency, then that deficiency is not going to go away. In organic agriculture, the normal deficiency is phosphorus. People have these fields that they've hayed for years, never added any additives, transition it to organic, and it grows terrible legumes because it doesn't have enough phosphorus. I think people who manage cattle probably know what different deficiencies look like, whether it's potassium deficiency or selenium or whatever. Like, be scientific and intelligent, test the feed that comes off that system to make sure it does have everything. And then you can start cycling, and like those ranches in southern Alberta at 1-4 and Stavely, and and the one that University of Alberta has near Edmonton, and there's a lot of very sustainable systems, provided you don't overgraze, right? And overgrazing is defined as grazing a plant before it's had a chance to recover from the previous grazing. And that's a huge one. And so, because then you get weed encroachment, and then that system really struggles to be that productive. So I think in principle, sure. But I would do a little testing on the side just to see if there's a deficiency, and then fix it if there is. And here's a question for that person. do they supplement the animals with any kind of salt licks or any kind of, feed supplement? Probably they do, because they know they might have a deficiency of some kind.
Okay, I have one more question here. So please, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask them yourself. We are open to that as well. So my last question here is, what do you attribute when increases in nitrogen and carbon sequestration versus when animals are integrated?
Could you repeat that question?
Corey, are you on the line? Could you elaborate on your question a bit?
You betcha. So in essence, what I was wondering is, what do you attribute the increase to the nitrogen uptake of the crops, and the increased carbon sequestration soon as you integrate animals into the system?
Okay, I think you're talking about that. So that example from Georgia there, and the other examples of where grazing increases carbon. It's about actually changing the physiology of the plant. So I mentioned that when the cow, wraps her tongue around the plant and tugs, the roots get a shock, and they lose a lot of their fine roots and root hairs, and those things are go into the organic matter. Okay, and then the plant quickly grows new root hairs, and so it actually becomes more productive. So that's how grazing can actually do that. The other, and there's other things that people, the other part of that is that having that animal on the land is going to cycle those nutrients better. And it's going to probably make nitrogen more available. And that's probably what drove your question, is by having the animals on there, you've got higher levels of available nitrogen, which allow you to fix the carbon, which I just explained a while back. So there's a couple of mechanisms happening in there.
For sure. Well, I found by integrating animals that 1 + 1 = 3. Okay. Because not only are you creating, a dense protein that is usable offsite, you're also increasing, the betterment of the soil, sequestration of carbon, and you're actually allowing nutrients to be absorbed or uptake even better. And I've seen exactly what you were talking about. So that's why I was wondering your take on what that was attributed to. So
yeah, the rumen of the cow, of the animal, is I like to think about it as portable soil. And the one thing that's interesting is, like, right now everything's frozen, but in the early spring and the late fall, plants may need some nutrients, and the soil organic matter has a hard time delivering that because the temperature in the soil is low, especially in the springtime. And if you can have an animal on there, and let's assume that the rumen is really kind of has the same bacterial processes as the soil, the rumen's warm. And so it's able to manage the nutrients for you at a time when the soil can't, because the soil is too cold. So
thank you so much. Appreciate that.
What's that?
I just said thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh yeah, so. And Johanna, or I don't know who said it, like, it was neat that the animals can manage the system. That's I think what I liked about that 7-year crop rotation. There's other examples of sort of that integrated management, and you're obviously practicing it. But if we think about the things that we do on the business as usual farm here on the right, the placement of the nutrients, soil testing to get the right nutrients, managing the residue, trying not to drive on the soil when it's wet. But in terms of especially the nutrient cycle, we spend a lot of money doing that. We can do that with animals. We can pretty well match every process that we right now do in agronomy with an animal integration. And so I just think it's very exciting. And that's a story that also needs to be celebrated, because that knowledge of doing that is in Corey's head. it resides in the community of the farmers like you and the agronomists that work with farmers to do that. And it doesn't always work perfect, but either does the business as usual side.
Awesome. I love that so much. Love to get rid of all my equipment just around cows. So Lise has her hand up here. Lise, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Great information tonight. There was a ton of information. I'm the Quebec guy that's asking the questions and had Ann Clark at my farm many times. And the thing that intrigued me the most about this, when you talked about the population growth and education, certainly with females, is what part of the population growth and the responsibility of that new population of where their food comes from and how it's produced, and the disconnect nowadays from people and food.
Yeah. Well, I've got an answer for you, but let me ask you, if there's one thing you could do to connect that, what would you suggest? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
I thoroughly enjoy that. I do it every day. I'm active on social media. I am the guy that messes people's heads up by talking about farming, about how proud I am about what we do, how we do it. I talk about food. I continually challenge people, but on a global scale, because for me, the problem is lack of information and education.
You know, I agree with you. I think that's really important. And I think a lot of the campaigns to help, you know, people who are not connected to farms understand agriculture are useful. But, and the pandemic has definitely strengthened people's interest in the food supply system, and they didn't realize how fragile it was. And you know, we also know that farmers are among the most respected Canadians, certainly in our country. But one of the other things that we've learned is that people want to participate. And so participation is actually a way of understanding things. And, you know, when I look at like CropLife Canada, the pesticide people, you know, educating the public, like that's going to fail every time, because, you know, you're just, you know, especially when we went through the GMO debate, participation is better. And how do we do that? You know, there's people who study that. There's people at the Arrow Center for Food Studies at the University of Guelph who study that. You could invite them to talk to you. Maybe something as simple as having a website on your food product that links and has a picture of a farm or tells a farm story. You know, then people say, I'm now participating with this community. And I think it's quite important. You know, there are some places where this is really, really serious. And India is one of them. And you probably will have seen, you know, people from India who drive semi-trailers who have, you know, farmers feed cities stickers on their trucks. And it's because in India, you know, they're trying to drive the small farmers off the land. And that's a real problem. So you know, different countries have different challenges in terms of how they respect agriculture. Not a great answer. And then maybe the bottom right of this slide, you know, the idea, like this is just the example of Bangkok. And, you know, these cities are starting to, you know, produce some food. I mean, they're never going to produce all the food for the city, especially big cities, but it creates an awareness. People say, wow, I can buy my lettuce locally. You know, I had no idea we could grow lettuce in a tower outside an office building, and all that stuff is happening now. And it creates that awareness of, where does my food come from? Well, where does my beef come from? Or where do my, you know, my pea protein come from? Well, it comes right here from home, you know. And So it all helps, but yeah. We can't eat money, but we can eat food. It's also really important to remember.
All right. Okay, so we had another question in the chat for you, Martin, regarding animal selection. So how do other species of animals compare to cows when grazing in terms of nutrient cycling?
I'm going to be real honest here. I don't have a clue. I don't know. Read Fred Provenza's book, and talk to maybe Ed Bork at the University of Alberta, somebody who does grazing stuff. I will make one little comment though about how animals all serve a different function. I mean, in the old forage textbook that was written at the University of Alberta, actually they talk about cattle. They don't graze a lot of forbs, right? They like to graze grass, and then sheep graze a little bit more of scrubby material, and goats graze more of it, and they eat, so they're better for weed control. So we know some of those things, but in terms of selecting for their nutrients, I'm not sure. I do also want to say just a thing about grazing pigs. Pigs, I mean, most pig farmers are not going to have their pigs grazing. It's not economical, but pigs can serve a really important role by being on the land. I mean, they've got these incredible noses. They go around and root for all kinds of things. I mean, that helps to kill quackgrass as well. But so there's a variation of that smell thing is where we're using dogs now to measure things like blackleg and canola. And there's a story in the Top Crop Manager, I think, a couple of years ago about that. So there's ways that we can integrate animals into our agriculture that we haven't done traditionally. Dogs, pigs, they can do very good diagnosis. So, but I really don't know what I'm talking about. Sorry, I can't answer your question.
All right. I just wanted to say we've kind of mentioned it a few times, but Fred Provenza's book is called Nourishment. You can find it on Amazon and stuff. Highly recommend. You could let him know that I will take a check for the advertising. Yeah, that was all for our questions. Anyone else have any questions for Martin before we sign off?
Another note on Fred Provenza is even if you just give him a search on YouTube, there's a ton of webinars and stuff up there where you can hear him speak before you buy his book.
All right.
I'm really glad that we've talked a bit about Fred Provenza and some of these questions about animals selecting. Does anybody in the audience have something to share where your animals will go for certain plants or certain parts of the field at certain times? Yeah, I'd love to hear that, because I think that's exactly that's how Fred would start the conversation. He'd say, "What are your animals doing?" Anybody?
Well, I know on my farm, we grew a cocktail cover crop and our swather broke down. So we wound up just leaving a strip standing for the winter. And the moose and the wildlife love sunflower.
Yeah.
We just annihilated the sunflowers. And then the cereals, then the brassicas. It was, kind of fun to watch.
Yeah.
I have kind of a broad observation. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I'm in South Central Kansas, and we've started growing some cover crops during the winter, rye and triticale, and in the spring, grazing those with cattle. Well, I've got some native grass also, and usually we don't graze that native grass as early as we were grazing the rye and triticale, but it was convenient for water sources and various reasons to give them access. And I don't know what they were eating out there, but they would definitely spend time out in the native grass area. Whereas we think, oh my, we have this lush green, rye and triticale. Well, there was probably a little bit of radish, but primarily rye and triticale. Anyway, just an observation. I don't know whether that changed how well they did, gain, but it was it was an observation that it felt good. It looked like they needed
Yeah.
it and wanted it. So
What did they all, but they also grazed the triticale and the other stuff, right?
oh
They
yeah,
went back-
yeah, I would,
Yeah.
and I'm out there, I'm kind of a gentleman farmer. I'd go out on the weekend, so I would observe, maybe, 20% would be, there would be kind of 20% usage or, numbers at a time out on that native grass, and it's in March and April, there's a little bit of small stuff that's starting to grow, but primarily it's just brown, looks like
Okay.
there's nothing. We like to burn it in April and then have lush green growth in May. So there's
So-
not what we consider very much out there. Maybe there's more than we think, but
Okay, so I want somebody who's listening to explain to Nathan what they think is happening and why those animals are going into the native from time to time after eating the lusher stuff, the triticale and the other stuff. I'm sure somebody knows the answer here.
maybe
And
you're talking about
does too.
fiber or something like that. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really great example. I mean, the animals, they're obviously walking to the native prairie for a reason, and they want that fiber. And
So it's not necessarily purely nutrition, or is fiber considered nutrition or, something along that line?
Sure. Absolutely. Fiber is, important for rumen function. And so does anybody else want to weigh in on this and explain that to somebody with a bit more animal science sort of understanding?
We have lots of folks in the chat saying that they're potentially looking for some minerals that they're lacking.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting.
The other part is I
Yeah,
found like,
Nathan.
Nathan, Corey here, one of the things that I found is, so if you're going to do something that's a little bit hotter, in the summertime, we've grazed some turnips and some different things like that. Always found it a good idea to put some, either some straw or some fescue straw or something like that out, because it's too hot for them and they need to go back and get something else so that they have the ability for that rumen to function. So if you have a really high quality, high energy, I guess is what the way I'll put it. If you have a high energy ration in a forage, you need some of that fiber for them to balance it out. It's almost like Pepto-Bismol to them. It keeps everything going so that they can keep functioning. So that's my take on it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This is Karen here. Oh, can I answer that question first before you go, Adam? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
From my experience, the animals, they like to go for the native range just because of what was already explained. Because, like what was already said, that basically the animals can be feeling a bit of stomach upset because there's too much, the microbes in the rumen are processing that stuff a little bit too fast. So then they start feeling a little bit pressure on the rumen and they start feeling a bit not too great. So then they have to go back to the rougher stuff, the more harder grasses, what Dr. Ed Work, my old rangeland prof, it was already mentioned here, he would call them, so that the animals can kind of self-medicate. The other thing is that and I noticed in the chat, was that in the rangeland, there's a lot more diverse species, and a lot of those species are the perennials, right? So a lot of the perennial forests, perennial shrubs, and when you see how the roots are, growing down there's different plants that have different root structures, but those have different types of mineral constituencies to them. So the animals could be going for those, selecting for different plants, because those plants will be having particular mineral profiles in them that the animals are kind of craving for. So I mean, when Dr. Fred Provenza has talked about, is that when the animals have a huge range of what I guess Joel Salatin would call a salad bar, then those animals have the choice to kind of go to those plants and just pick out what they want based on their needs, based on whether they want more fiber, whether they want more particular minerals and that kind of thing. So it could be very much, Nathan, it could be very much combination of two things.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, Adam, you wanted to chat about your goats and how they grazed?
Someone said in the comments that their cows went nuts for the broadleaves, and I would definitely confirm that that's the case for goats too. Just about the only thing that they like, they're like a magnet to grain, and second would be like sunflowers, pretty much anything broadleaf. Even if I'm chopping down poplar, they'll run. And someone else mentioned spruce or pine. It just all sorts of stuff like that. Would not think is standard forage. They just love it. So they'll pass over alfalfa and go for the trees if they can reach the leaves. So it's lots of opportunities for grazing other than your traditional right on in a field. So
Awesome.
I want to say one more interesting thing I noticed. I was out, I think a couple of years ago or something, just doing a pasture assessment for someone way up north there, and with his cows, and he was just kind of wondering how the pasture was doing. So when I was doing my observations, I was noticing particular dandelion plants were actually being selected. Selected in their, like, dandelions in their pasture, like you got 12 inches, they're grazed right down to nothing. And I noticed that these dandelion were actually selected, and the grass around them was being completely ignored. So, and of course, these were cows that had calves on them, so they were suckling. So obviously the dandelion had some calcium, magnesium, some other nutrients that they weren't getting from the other plants. I thought that was really fascinating, that they'll just go for those particular plants and ignore the other ones around. Cows are cool. Animals are neat.
I think we have a hand up here.
Yeah, that's another Quebec perspective. Again, sometimes we have too much moisture. We have extreme growth in June. I've seen times when we had orchard grass that would be headed out and it'd be very, very high after many days of rain. We moved the steers 4 times a day. So after a couple of days of no sun, the steers would go after just the seed heads in the morning. The next time we'd move them at noon, the leaves, and by mid-afternoon on the sunny day, they would be down looking for the clovers. So it's about where the energy is in the plant, and that the steers were always looking for the part of the plant at that time of day which had the most energy. And those observations to me was like fascinating, because if we leave the animals to decide what they need, they'll always get what they need.
That's really interesting. These have been, I think, really important observations. I mean, I think that's one thing about integrated farming that's so wonderful, is because the knowledge within the farming community, within the mind of any one farmer, is very rich, and that's why I think it, I enjoy this so much. And I think what we, if people understand the rumen and understand what its needs are, if you remind yourself that the rumen and the soil are really quite similar. Some really good soil management practices can come from people who have experience with grazing animals.
Okay. Do we have any more comments, questions, discussion? There's some conversation happening in the chat around why animals are potentially going after these woody plants, and that spruce tips produce lots of tannins that are great for parasite control. They're high in vitamins, which I didn't know, vitamin A and C, as well as antimicrobial and antibacterial properties.
Yeah.
Or you know. All right. Last call for questions before I turn it back to Johanna. Going once, going twice. All right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for coming on tonight. It was great to have you all. And thank you, Martin, for the presentation. It was very good and prompted some awesome discussion. So thank you very much for making time for that. We appreciate it.
And thank you for the invite. It's always, I mean, it's an honor and a privilege to have a chance to talk to people about things that I'm excited about. We don't always mesh in terms of what I do and what your needs are, but I think the discussion was really rich and it was great. And congratulations on having such a diverse audience. This was really great. I mean, people from Kansas and Quebec and all over Alberta, and even there was one person from Manitoba, I believe. So well done. Good job on the questions.
Thank you very much.
I'm honestly excited to go back and watch the recording of this.
Absolutely. There's some great information. And I know you said you were an agronomist, so you didn't come to the cow part till later, but it's so interesting to have that different perspective on the whole grazing cattle thing. So that was awesome.
Great.
All righty. Well, with that, I'll stop the recording and I will hopefully have it out to everybody here at the end of next week. And we'll see you at the next session next Friday. So thank you everybody for tuning in.